Hello, Christopher Brent here, coming to you today with a music history podcast on the classical period. So, I love talking about music history, and I am going to give a podcast here on the musical and philosophical aspects of the classical period, and I am going to try to keep myself focused without going on too many tangents here because I love talking about this stuff. So, if I go on any tangents, forgive me and stay tuned, and I promise I will get back on track. So I'm going to do my best to stay focused. So anyway, let's get down to business. I am a pianist, a music educator, and a piano teacher here from Michigan in the United States. And because I'm a pianist, I may put a little more focus on the keyboard music from the classical period, more so than anything. So forgive me if I do that. So speaking of keyboard music, let's start with that. So in the classical period, we do see a transition from the harpsichord into the piano, which is certainly a big thing when we're looking at instrumentation. So the piano has many expressive aspects that the harpsichord does not. So on the piano, you can make a crescendo and a diminuendo. You can play louder and softer, and you were not able to do this on the harpsichord. So we see some new aspects expressively coming into play with the piano. And of course, Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven take full advantage of that by composing these wonderful piano sonatas. So let's look at dates. Classical period basically starts at about 1750, and we go into about 1825. So we're looking, yes, classical period at 1750 to around 1825 or so. 1750 is a big date because that's the year that J.S. Bach passes away. So at this point, the torch is passed on to the next generation from the Baroque period, which is the predecessor to the classical period. The torch is passed on from the Baroque period to the classical period right there around 1750. So once J.S. Bach passes away, we kind of see these new ideals of the classical period come into play, and the torch is passed on to J.C. Bach and C.P.E. Bach and many other composers in the early classical period, like Boccherini and Stamitz. They're already starting to do some of these new ideas that, musically speaking, reflect the philosophical ideas of classical antiquity, which is from the Greco-Roman world. This resurgence was coming into the culture, in the mid-1700s, late 1700s, and the idea of rationalism and reason and all of this, which is big, of course, with the Enlightenment movement. This is heavily influential on Mozart and Haydn and everything. So what we see musically going on at this time is a decreased sense of polyphony. We don't have all of the lavishness of the Baroque period. We don't have all of the ornaments, and we don't have as much counterpoint, you could say. We don't have all of this decoration on this in the sound in the same way. We don't have multiple voices, 4, 5, 6 voices, sometimes even dozens of voices going on like we did in the Baroque period. We see a more, like a lighter elegance and a delightful sense of song-like melodies coming out of the foreground of the music, which they will call the galant style. So we see this emphasis on simplicity and reason, and it's all over the music. And of course, this is big in the culture because the culture is moving into the Enlightenment period, which focuses on rationalism and reason. So let's look at composers. Of course, we have Mozart. Mozart is basically the kingpin of the classical period, if you want to put it that way. We have Haydn, we have Beethoven, we have Clementi, we have Kuhlau. Of course, we have J.C. Bach and C.P.E. Bach, the Bach sons there. So J.C. Bach and C.P.E. Bach were the sons of the big guy, Johann Sebastian Bach. Who else am I missing from the classical period? I think I got pretty much everybody I was thinking of. There's other great composers from the classical period. Oh, Hummel. Hummel was the one I was thinking of. Hummel is a great composer. There's many more. If you think of any more that I missed, leave them in the comments because, yes, I'm always looking to find new composers that I may not have initially heard of and whatnot. So those are some of the great composers. We certainly see Mozart, at the forefront of the classical period, so he's obviously going to be a big figure. And Beethoven is going to be the guy that segues the musical ideas into the Romantic period, which the Romantic period will start right around 1820, 1825 or so, and the Romantic period will go right up until about 1900, really. So with form in the classical period, we see the sonata as basically the most important form, you could say, with the classical period. So the sonata form is big, the rondo form is big, theme and variations is certainly a big aspect as well. So sonata form is very important because basically what a sonata is, it's a work for solo instrument, or sometimes more than one instrument, but like a piano sonata or a violin sonata or a cello sonata, we see this as a big thing. So Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven and Clementi write sonatas, and a sonata has a first movement, a second movement, and a third movement. Sometimes it has a fourth movement, but basically the first movement is marked allegro, which is kind of a lively, fast tempo, and then the second movement is very slow, and then the third movement is usually very fast, and the third movement is usually in what they call rondo form. So sonata form, the first movement is really important because we have three parts to that movement: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. Sometimes they just call that the recap. But the sonata form, that first movement has those three parts. Think of it as like the beginning, the middle, and the end. So in that first part of the sonata, the main theme is introduced, then it develops quite a bit, and Mozart was really good at developing the music in that middle section, that development section of the sonata, and then we see the recap come back and kind of restate things again. So that was a really big thing. Composers and audiences knew this sonata form quite well, and it's really set in stone. It's kind of put in place now in the classical period. And someone like Beethoven is going to take that sonata form, and he's going to kind of toy with it in a certain way and expand upon that and revolutionize a few ideas that eventually will move things into the Romantic mindset a little bit. So Beethoven was known for that. Mozart was good at taking ideas that were kind of already there from many other composers, and he basically found a way to just make those ideas into something not just good but great. So Beethoven was doing something a little bit different. He was moving things into the more Romantic style as he got a little bit older. But philosophy was important and very much so a big part of things. Beethoven was certainly moved by some things that were going on philosophically and even politically with Napoleon along the way with the French Revolution, although there was some back and forth with that. Beethoven was not very fond of Napoleon after a while. So, but that's another story right there. But yes, these ideas of reason, rationalism, and simplicity, you could say, that were part of the Enlightenment, and these ideas from classical antiquity were certainly heavily influential on the composers. So I always talk about the Baroque period with this Christmas tree picture, right? The Baroque period is this Christmas tree with all these decorations, all these lights, all these ornaments. It's so decorated that there's just no room left on the tree, right? Well, we see the tree in the classical period it's much different. There's hardly really many ornaments on the tree at all. And they're laid out on the tree in very perfect order, right? So, like with the classical period, if you've ever been into somebody's house and you've seen the pictures on the wall set in a absolutely perfectly symmetrical manner, like everything in their house, like the furniture, the pictures, like the chairs that are pushed into the table, like at perfect angles, almost like you could see like a OCD kind of person or something, like where everything is so perfectly symmetrical. That's the classical period, right? The reason and the rationale has kind of cemented the phrases together in a way where it's almost like too perfect. There's phrases in the classical period. They're often laid out in very even numbered ways. Like there's a 2-measure phrase followed by a 4-measure phrase. There's never anything with like 5 measures or like 9 measures or 11 measures. There's not any odd meter changes. I shouldn't say that there's never instances of this, but for the most part, we don't really have meter changes or a lot of odd numbered things going on. Everything is very sort of neatly laid out, right? So that's kind of the idea. A fashionable thing with form that I do like from the classical period is the form of theme and variations. And that was a big thing in the classical period. So one of my favorite examples of theme and variations is the Mozart theme and variations on the theme of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So what Mozart does is he takes the theme of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and you actually play that first. That's the very first part of it. It's very simple, the theme, right? And then after that, he has many variations. I believe it's 12 variations, and the variations are very fancy derivatives, so to speak, of this of the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star theme, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Beethoven was very good at writing theme and variations. He wrote a theme and variations on the theme of Diabelli. So he was another great composer that I just thought of from the classical period is Diabelli. So it was very common. So Mozart and Beethoven wrote in this style of theme and variations, and there were a few composers that wrote with theme and variations in the Romantic period as well. Brahms wrote a terrific set of theme and variations on a theme of Handel, actually. So it would continue on into the Romantic period, this idea of theme and variations. The concerto really opens up. The solo concerto, Mozart writes 27 piano concertos. Beethoven has 5 piano concertos that are basically a staple in the literature. They're really amazing works. So Mozart and Haydn writes piano concertos, Beethoven writes piano concertos, and that's a big thing. So in the concerto form, they're using this idea of 3 movements usually, with the first movement being somewhat fast, the middle movement, the second movement is very slow, and then the third movement is, of course, usually very fast in the rondo form. So these are some basic aspects of the classical period, just to kind of simplify things, to sort of wrap it up a little bit. Hopefully I haven't gone on for too long. One other thing, actually, before I kind of wrap it up, I can't contain myself, right? One thing that's important to know is just this idea of the song-like melody being at the foreground of the music. So in a piano sonata, right, it's typical to have that song-like melody right on top, sitting on top in the right hand, and the left hand playing a very simple accompaniment, which they call an Alberti bass. So a chord is basically broken up into individual notes, into parts, and that's what accompanies this melody. And this is done all the time by Haydn and Mozart and Clementi and Beethoven. Sometimes it's not easy to play, I should say. I mean, I talk about the simplicity aspect of the classical period. It doesn't mean that the works are easy to play by any stretch, not even close, really. It's still difficult, and you still need, a lot of technique. But it's just this idea, this gallant style of that song-like melody being there, with sometimes a simple accompaniment, sometimes kind of a somewhat complicated accompaniment. But it's this Alberti bass where the chord is spread out in this unique way. That's really common. So anyway, so you want to know that the classical period is heavily based on these ideas of the Greco-Roman world, and the Enlightenment was a big part of it, in rationalism and reason, and some of the ideals of the French Revolution, which kind of eventually turned dark But that's a little bit later on, almost as we get into the 1800s, or a little bit before. Know that Beethoven was a classical period composer that bridged the gap between the classical period and the Romantic period. That's something that's very important to know. And you want to know what the sonata form is, and the rondo form, and the theme and variations. And the instrumentation is still somewhat simple in a way. We see the instrumentation aspect grow more in the Romantic period and in the 20th century. So the orchestras are still not huge as far as like the number of musicians that we'll start to see as we compare things, to the Romantic and 20th century. We're going to see a big growth in the size of the orchestra as we get into the Romantic period and in the 20th century. So know that the harpsichord gets replaced by the piano. That's a big change as far as instrumentation. So hopefully this gives you some insight and some information into the philosophy and the musical aspects of the classical period. So if you have questions, email me at chrisbrentmusic@gmail.com. Visit my website at www.christopherbrent.com and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful day.